on Thursday when we had our meeting, we kind of talked a little bit in regards to the Spark advisory panels. And we actually had that information that relayed out to the committee members of the 4 advisory panels for the Spark committee and the designations for those committees and the individuals who are serving on those, as some of you had asked for that. So we had that distributed out to the committee members. Also, we have at your place settings the Emergency Medical Services Board report, which is in accordance with the 2021 session laws that was passed in the budget bill, House Bill 2007. And so those have been emailed to the committee members. Committee, are there any bill introductions this morning? All right, seeing none. We're going to go ahead and move into the presentation in regards to the, first we're going to skip over the Home and Community-Based Services Intellectual and Developmental Disability Waiver Committee report because the individual with the research department is in a Senate committee right now. So we're going to come back to that later. He should be done about 9:30. And so we're going to start with the informational briefing on the intellectual and developmental disability provider reimbursement rate. And so the first is going to be Vicki Keffer, Director of Human Services for the Sunflower Diversified Services. Vicki, welcome to committee.
Now I've got a red light. Wonderful. Representative Waymaster and committee members, thank you for having me here today. I'm the Director of Human Resources at Sunflower Diversified Services. We're right in the middle of Kansas, Great Bend. Our typical employment numbers are about 160 employees. Currently, we have 125. 125 employees trying to do 160 employees' value of work, providing independent supports for adults with disabilities. When we think about what it takes to develop a career and make it a career choice to be employed doing services for others, we're not competing in the industry. When I drive down 10th Street in Great Bend, Arby's, blowing our wage out of the water, Brahms. It's very different employment when we're talking about, would you like fries with that? Or I need to give you some medication to save your life and perform CPR. That's a very different employment choice. And we're expecting our employees to make those types of choices every day for $10 an hour. $10 an hour doesn't do a lot when our population tends to be single women. It also tends to be high school educated women that usually have at least 2 children at home. Our daily shift is a 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. Most schools don't take kids at 7 a.m. and they expect you to have them picked up by 4. So they're making other arrangements for their families. And then you know what they do? They go to a residential setting and they'll work till 11 o'clock that night. They're not putting their babies to bed, someone else is. And we're asking them to make those sacrifices and do those things for $10 an hour. One of the local manufacturers in our area that has the same educational requirements as Sunflower, we'd ask for a high school diploma. We ask you to be able to pass a drug screen. We also need you to have a driver's license. Those seem like some pretty basic requirements, but you can work in Essex and Hoisington and get a $2,500 signing bonus. We're a nonprofit organization. We can't manage to do that. So we've got employees that are dedicating their life, their soul. They're missing out on family activities. And when we do get employees to come and consider us as an employment organization and to consider us as a career, we're spending over $300 just getting their backgrounds ran. Then we're investing 30 days in their training. We're giving them annual trainings. We're doing all of that as paid time training. And we typically don't keep them for more than 90 days because they know that they can go work at Brahms or Arby's or on a manufacturing line and not have the responsibility of saving someone that's choking on their food because they need assistance, or providing bathroom care because they need assistance. Most people are not going to choose a $10 job to provide that type of intimate care when they can go stand at a window at Arby's and get more pay. They're also not going to be asking for the dedication that we ask, because we need them to be present at work. They can't be on their phones. They can't be standing out on a smoke break. They can't be socializing with their buddies. They need to be present, because the people that we're serving need us to be present for them to continue to live independent lives. When we think about the opportunity to have an independent life, it's a right that they have as Kansans, and we need support from this committee in order to help grow the career opportunities, the future of developmental disability support, direct support professionals within the state of Kansas. This is not just a pandemic situation. We've been experiencing this way before COVID got here, and it continues to get worse. Sitting on my office desk right now, I have 10 terminations. I can't hire them faster than they leave. And they leave because of the commitment, the education that they're required to have, and the dedication to the job that we ask of them. Those 10 employees, I enrolled them in benefits. Now I'll be unenrolling them in benefits, and I'll be dedicating a lot of time just getting them in and out the door, when really we need staff, we need intensive training, and the monetary reward is falling short. What we're asking of them is too much. We need your help. We need to fine-tune the resources, expand the professional education that will help people develop and commit to careers in our industry. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Vicki, and thank you for your testimony today and this informational briefing. If I could ask, I mean, obviously I represent a portion of Barton County, and you had referenced Great Bend in your comments. What is the service area for Sunflower Diversified? We
serve Barton, Rice, Rush, Pawnee, and Stafford.
So you have 5 counties.
We do.
That you service.
Yes, sir.
And if I heard you right, you said you have 125 employees, but you have a employment capacity of 160?
That's correct.
And what is the demand that is put on the current employees that you currently have in regards to servicing those 5 counties?
So we, in the perfect world, we would hire people in that area. Right now, if you live in Barton, we may be sending you to Rice or sending you to Pawnee. And so now we're putting you in a vehicle, in a company car, paying you travel to get to the location to provide those services. So in the perfect world, we would hire members in that community and be able to service the individuals in that community with employees from that community.
And you had mentioned that I guess basic wage is $10 an hour?
It is.
In your, in thinking of the capacity for your employees, what is the ideal wage?
Oh, gosh. So I would be walking on clouds if my staff could earn $15, $16 an hour, because that's what would help encourage them to be committed to that career. And right now, when we're paying $10 an hour, that's a little bit over $20,000 a year. It's not a living wage.
Representative Helgerson.
First, let me say thank you very much for your work and your service. I'm going to ask you and ask the other individuals, not now, but sometime in the future. We can't afford or I don't think we're going to be able to afford what's necessary to take care of your employees now and in the future. If you look at just the scale of increases that we have, and not only in your industry, but in the nursing homes and in hospitals, the demands that are placed on the employees that provide the services to our population that is getting older, more in need of intensive care, I just can't see that, even though we have a surplus right now, that we can sustain the increases that would be necessary to keep up. I wonder about tax credits, if that could help some way in the future. If, you know, daycare opportunities provide, you know, we need a different model. Because Kansas, if you look at the long-term trends, we're going to be more in demand in the future than many of the other states, and we'll probably have less resources and less resources in the rural area, especially. So if you can come up with some other ideas, that would be real helpful, because that's what we're also going to need. We can give you maybe a short-term fix of more money, but we got to change the environment, because we've been pushing community programs for many, many years. In fact, I have been for 25 or 30 years, but it's worked, but we're also going to have the problems that has caused. So help us try to come up with a solution.
I will brainstorm, and we'll make sure we get some communication back to you.
And kind of going off of Representative Helgerson's comment, you know, when I was in the corporate field, we'd always try to be the employer of choice, and that not always necessarily was based off pay. It was how do employers try to maintain and keep their employees, because there's always going to be a competitive market in regards to the pay structure, but what type of environment do you set up in place to retain your employees that you currently have? So obviously there's different ideas that we can discuss as far as the legislature in regards to this particular situation. But sometimes pay is the easy
Yes.
discussion to have, but it might not be the only resolution to address this issue.
Certainly.
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this isn't my area of expertise, so I need a little education or refresh my mind. So you guys are reimbursed. Is that the way it works? You're reimbursed based upon a certain service provided. Is that right?
Yes, and upon the level of service that we provide, correct.
Okay, so you do X, you get X dollars, you do Y, you get another dollar. Is there any efficiencies in that? You know, like there's certain services I'm sure that 80% of your clients recommend or need. Correct. And then there are certain services that are very few percentage of your clients need it. Is that a fair assumption?
So we work very hard on efficiencies within our organization. So if we have a group of individuals that are all nonverbal, are all wheelchair bound, all need assistance with feeding and therapies, water therapy, massage therapy, engagements in their community, then we do try to keep those individuals together so that we can minimize our staffing while still providing adequate supports.
And what percentage of your budget is salaries and wages? Do you have any idea?
I don't. That's kind of outside of my realm, but I can get that answer for you.
Right, because what we're not really actually looking at, if we go from 10 to 15, we're not looking at a 50% increase. We're looking at some percentage. And I agree with the prior speakers that, you know, we need to look at other options, but I'm just curious of the scale.
Sure, I can find that out for you. And one of the things that Representative Waymaster kind of touched on is once we get them there, how do we keep them? So we do everything from fun activities to May hats to Secret Valentines to our 403B matching funds to a nice PTO schedule. We can actually donate PTO. If somebody comes up sick, I can donate some of my time to you. And just finding those ways to engage them within the organization so that we have more strings to them. So we have 16 different benefits that we offer, everything from gym to long-term disability to health insurance, all of those things, trying to tie them to our company, because the more ties we can get to them, the more likely we are to get them to stay.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to get better context for your testimony, thank you for providing that. Are you providing exclusive community-based services for those 5 counties, or are you a private company that's also competing with other private companies that are providing community-based, home-based services?
So I'm not totally sure I know what your question is, but I'll attempt. We're a nonprofit organization, and we do compete with for-profit organizations in our community for the same base of employees. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. So,
Great.
but we are specifically talking about those adults that are living in community homes within our neighborhoods, correct?
Yes.
So then my last question would be, when we're looking at hourly wages and the crunch that you're feeling, and then there's competition out there in this particular sector, is this the community-based model that we are moving to? Is that the most efficient way to deploy services and resources? And as you are working through these struggles, can you think of more efficient ways that the state of Kansas can address these issues?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So as an organization, not necessarily on the state level, but for us as an organization, we're working right now on a housing model within our community that we've got some sponsorships from some private investors so that we can have, instead of the 2 of you living on the east side of the town and the 2 of you living on the west side of town, and I need to provide services for you, and I'm going to be driving back and forth, more of a community living model with apartments and structures that is groundbreaking in the spring. So that will help us with efficiencies within our organization to just have those areas closer. Am I touching on your answer at all?
I think a little bit. I am concerned with the proliferation of many, many, many different community homes throughout our communities, and therefore that could create, even though it's well-intended and federally required perhaps even, it may have consequences such as driving up the cost and safety concerns for those individuals because the workforce is spread too thin. So it was just more of a bigger question of how the state could address it and provide, because it doesn't look like we're, to the representative's comments from Sedgwick County, that we're going to be able to sustain it long term. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. A couple of questions. The budgets are about 80% salary. And there's about 20,000 ID and DD workers in our state. So just to give you a context of what we're dealing with there. But I do agree, and I've had conversations, everybody's been in my office talking about workforce. I've just told them, point blank is, you have to realize that after all this, money is not the only option. We have to look outside the box, think about what the private sector, what people would do to attract employees and keep employees. And I'll tell you another simple one right here, just in your testimony. So you start at 7 a.m. and you have staff that's having a trouble getting their kids to school. So how hard would it be to open at 8 so they could get their kids to school? I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying that's the kind of thing that the private sector folks deal with, and we need to be looking at, all of us need to be looking at, what makes it easier for an employee to be an employee. And so that's just a very simple thing. I don't know how much logistics there are in that.
We actually just moved to the 7 a.m. probably 9 months ago. We were at 8:15, and we had our night staff working till 8:15, but they weren't able to get to their day jobs, and they needed time to go home and bathe and freshen up to go to their day jobs. And so we actually just moved about 9 months ago to the 7 a.m.
Well, very good. At least you've looked at that then.
We have,
And it's
yeah,
not
extensively.
Not successful. But anyway, well, thank you. Thank you, committee.
All right, committee, any further questions for Ms. Keffer? Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so you mentioned in a perfect world. In a perfect world, can you tell me one thing that would make it feasible, you think, to keep your employees? One thing that you think you could do differently that we could help you with?
Education. Creating some type of an educational certificate platform. I see people that are so proud of their CNA certificates, people that have their CNA certificates, CMA, CNA, nurse assistant, nurse aide. Those certification programs tie them because they've given of their time and their dedication, and it was something outside of just meeting the minimum income requirements, but for them to feel valued in having that recognition of, I know these things, I passed an exam, look, I have a certificate, maybe I even have a pen. And I think that would help tie people to our organization.
Good answer. Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair.
All right, any further questions? See none? Thank you for being here today, Vicki.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Next, we have Matt Fletcher, the Executive Director of EnterHab, and he is joining us virtually. Matt, are you on?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you all can hear me adequately in the hearing room today.
We can hear you.
My apologies for not being there with you. My son is positive for COVID, and so the Fletcher family is hunkering down for a quarantine period. We're learning how to keep a 2.5-year-old preoccupied and happy and not screaming through daddy's testimony to the committees. With that, Mr. Chair, I will launch into my testimony in the hope that we don't hear any noises from my son this morning. But thank you so much for the opportunity to appear in front of this committee today on this incredibly important issue. Before I go into my written testimony, I'd like to respond to a few of the committee's questions to the previous conferee. And they focus on the themes of sustainability and efficiency, and finally on the requirements of the state of Kansas. And so to the point of sustainability, I'll just point out that the state of Kansas ranks 44th in the level of reimbursement to community IDD service providers and lower than all contiguous states around us. So I understand the concerns about sustainability, but the state of Kansas, as we have pointed out to this committee and to other legislative committees, has for the past 20 plus years not funded these services appropriately. They're chronically underfunded, which is a big part of why we're seeing these types of problems occur now. The second issue as to efficiency, I'll just point out that these service networks were grown locally. They're not something that came from the federal government or from the state government. They started with parents and families in your communities, and they're highly efficient service networks. They are constantly looking for ways to do their work better, and I can tell you that we are assisting our members right now with looking at technology solutions that can assist, not replace, but assist in some of these workforce shortages. The bottom line, though, is that for many Kansans with intellectual and developmental disabilities, their needs are significant enough that they require 24-hour service and supports. And that means that we're going to have to find someone to be there with them. There's no technology that can replace that. There are no efficiencies that ultimately can resolve that either. And so we have to keep that in mind as we discuss these service networks. And then finally, as to requirements, I'll just point out that our state's constitution requires that we provide services to this population. The federal government mandates that services be available for this population. And in fact, the HCBS IDD waiver is in itself a literal waiver from institutional care, which is a mandate. So if these services don't survive, if the networks can't be sustainable into the future, that means that the state of Kansas will be required to provide support to this population through other means, which would be its institutional system. That system costs quite a bit more than what's being invested currently into the community. Those are my answers, and again, thank you for those questions. I think they're wonderful questions, and it shows that you're really exploring these issues. But as I pointed out previously, this system has been underfunded for more than 2 decades. And while we've made some progress, particularly in the last number of years, we're still far, far behind where this system should have been had we provided updates and funding every year just to account for inflationary increases. And so as we entered the pandemic 2 years ago, this system was already struggling with recruiting and retaining direct care workers. Now, 2 years later, they are desperately behind almost every other entity in your communities in their ability to attract an adequate workforce to serve Kansans with IDD. And again, as I've said before, if this system of community supports fails, we will be placing Kansans with intellectual and developmental disabilities in jeopardy regarding their services. We must not allow this to happen. We do appreciate the work of this committee and other similarly important committees in 2021. The legislature as a whole made significant steps forward last year in examining the causal factors behind these issues that confront the IDD service system. And in addition to that, you all in your budget for fiscal year 2023 included a significant rate increase. I want to thank you so much on behalf of Kansas providers for that increase. It truly was a lifeline that came to providers mid-year last year as they were struggling through this workforce shortage. So thank you for your support in 2021. However, it needs to be noted that that increase, as significant as it was, did not make providers whole for the underfunding that they've experienced. I'd like to move on now in my testimony to highlight some results and outcomes of a recent survey that we completed of InterHab members regarding their workforce challenges in the last year. So these answers that I'm going to give you from our membership are based upon what they experienced in 2021. The turnover rate for providers, as indicated in 2021 for direct care, was about 48%, which is higher than the national average. That's to be expected given the underfunding that the system has experienced. The length of stay, as Vicki pointed out in her testimony, is extraordinarily short for new hires. And in 2021, our members reported an average of just 116 days for new direct care hires. That's less than 4 months. It's just long enough, however, as you heard from Vicki, for organizations to place a substantial amount of an investment in those new hires in terms of onboarding. So they're going through the process of training and providing that onboarding process, which is highly expensive, only to lose those folks within about a quarter of employment. What that means for the organizations in terms of costs are that those empty daycare or day and residential shifts have to be filled by someone. And so what we found from our members is that an average of close to 3,000 hours of direct care shifts had to be filled by other staff within their organizations. That means, all hands on deck, anyone who has the ability after they finish their work in the accounting department or as a case manager or elsewhere, anyone who has that ability to fill in an extra shift on top of that, they were doing that about 3,000 hours worth per organization. Of course, this resulted in overtime for organizations, and as I included in my testimony, that amounted to an average of about $355,000 in overtime costs last year. and about 26,000 hours of overtime. Now, I know there have been some questions about the rate increase that was included in last year's budget, and so we went ahead and asked our members about how they utilized that rate increase that they received last July. What our members told us is that on average, about 97% of that rate increase that you included in the budget for providers was utilized last year for direct care wages and benefits. So it's clear that providers were hemorrhaging on these direct care positions, and they used almost everything you gave them last year in additional funding to try and staunch those wounds. How they used it included about 92% of providers offering wage increases to their direct care staff, 42%, 43% offered bonuses, another 36% offered wage differentials, 21% adjusted benefits in some manner or shape or form to try and make the position more appealing to new applicants, and 14% offered hero or hazard pay initiatives. Now, the rate increase you all provided was significant, but as I pointed out before, it did not make providers whole. So last year, due to the workforce crisis, they had to pull, beg, borrow, and steal from a number of other sources to be able to try and remain competitive in recruiting and retaining a direct care workforce. And I went ahead and asked our members how they did that last year. 85% of them, almost 86% of providers offered bonuses. Additional 64% offered wage increases, 64% offered wage differentials. Again, these were from other sources of funding other than the rate increase. They went ahead and matched what you gave them with other sources to do these things to be attractive to applicants. And how did they do that? Where did they get the additional funds to be able to do that? 64% of our respondents to our survey said they rated their organizational reserves to be able to do that. 57% indicated that they redirected funding that had initially been budgeted for other items, perhaps other positions that then were consolidated or folded into this, or other program and service needs. They took those to be able to offer these additional benefits and incentives for direct care workers. Another 50% indicated that they used federal and state relief funds that were made available to them last year. And then 14% indicated that they through some development process or fundraising process, were able to put some additional funding into wages and benefits for their direct care workforce. I'd like to just close because we had a number of conferees who had wanted to provide some additional testimony today, but due to time constraints, could not. I'm aware that their testimony has been provided to you all electronically, but there was one piece in one of the conferees' testimony that I found so compelling I wanted to bring it forward to you today. It was from Colin McKinney's testimony. Colin is the CEO and president of Starkey in Wichita, Kansas. And in his testimony, he shared an email that had been sent out recently on a Friday evening from one of their residential supervisors within Starkey's workforce. It just shows the desperation in terms of workforce needs. The email that was sent out goes as follows. It says, "Hello. I know many of you may not see this until Monday, but if you're reading this, we could use your help. All of the supervisors who don't have COVID are either here or have already headed to a group home to work tonight, and in many cases are working all weekend as well. I know so many of you and your staff are already signed up for a shift or two, so thank you from the bottom of my heart. But for the few who see these emails and trust that we will always figure it out without your help, we cannot figure it out. When we have more openings than we've ever had in the history of the organization, and with so many out with COVID, there are not currently enough people to go around. So here's what we still have left." And then she went on to indicate just a wide number of positions on Friday night for the weekend that still had not been filled. We do appreciate your support. We know that this is hard work that you engage in. You hear from multiple entities who all are facing similar challenges. And so we do appreciate your attention this morning to this issue. All I can say is that the only way that we can address this adequately is by working collaboratively. I think the questions earlier about how we can continue to explore efficiencies are valid and important questions. I can tell you that providers are there with you in exploring those options, but we must also be able to have access to the resources that we need to field an adequate workforce. And with that, I'll stand for questions from the committee.
All right, thank you for being here today, Matt. Committee, are there any questions for Mr. Fletcher? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if this question isn't, if you're not able to answer this question, then perhaps our Chair of Social Service Budget could today or at another time. But as we're looking at this and trying to assess the need, are we to make the assumption that the IDD population is going up? Or are the IDD providers, the number of providers in the system going up? And what may account for either one of those scenarios? And if the IDD providers, the number of providers is increasing, therefore expanding the number of people we need for the workforce, are those providers at capacity based on available bed space? Or I've already heard that you don't have staffing, you have staffing limitations, but just trying to understand the openings in the system based on the growing providers. Thank you.
Well, I would never presuppose to have more wisdom than the chair of the House Social Service Budget Committee, but I will try my best to answer your questions. I can say that the IDD population is increasing. It increases every year. And the complexity of the population is also increasing as well. So in the early 90s, when much of this community-based system was designed and put in place in terms of the funding mechanisms that you all utilize to fund this system, the population that these community service providers were serving at that time was by and large much less complex in terms of its service needs. Now today, we are seeing a number of more complex needs in areas that we never anticipated back in the early 90s. For example, age-related illnesses has been something that, due to the success of the system, has been increasingly needed, the types of services and supports for persons who have Alzheimer's and dementia, but also have an intellectual disability. 50 years ago, this population, by and large, was living to an average age of about 45, 50 years old. Because of the success of these community systems, we are literally keeping these individuals alive longer. And now they have a lifespan that matches to a large degree the general population. They also have an earlier onset of age-related illnesses. So we are having to serve them for conditions such as Alzheimer's and dementia in their 50s and 60s. That requires incredibly specialized supports to be able to serve that population in the community, and that's what we're facing. We also have a population that has over 50% of which has a mental illness, many of whom have significant behavioral health issues that manifest in physically aggressive or sexually aggressive manners, and those require highly specialized supports to keep those individuals in the community. So not only is the population growing, Representative, it's also getting more complex and more challenging to provide supports to. As to your second question regarding the provider network, I'm not so certain that the provider network is expanding. In fact, I wonder if it's not contracting. At one point in the last decade, I saw a number that totaled around 300 providers that had a licensure or a limited licensure. The latest number that we received during our special committee hearings back in October was somewhere in the 200s. And so I wonder, although I don't have the data to back it up, I wonder if this network has not contracted. And I can tell you just from what I hear from providers across the state, they have a hard time finding placements for individuals who need service and support. Who come into service through crisis exceptions. They might have been waiting on the waiting list, but they are in crisis and so need services immediately. Those are very difficult placements because the capacity is by and large not there anymore.
Well, Representative Williams, did you have a follow-up?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does the chairman of the Social Services Budget Committee wish to share his wisdom?
Well, I think that I knew that it truly is an aging population, and they're living a lot longer. The folks are living a lot longer, and they're dealing with more complex needs. It's not, and I do believe that the providers are shrinking. I don't think there's as many, but Matt covered it all. So, Matt, don't do that to me again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, any further questions for Matt? Representative Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would, if the committee has not spent a day in one of these facilities, I would challenge you to do that. We sit here, in our committee and appropriations, everybody comes before us and we don't know, and I'm no expert by any means, but spending a day in Hill City a year or two ago before COVID, what your folks do is beyond, it's something I couldn't do. I just, I mean, it would be very much a struggle. So I guess, and then maybe even the earlier question, I mean, obviously, I mean, the dollar amounts are one thing, and it seems like when we do increase some of the rates, it's still not enough. So, and Jerry Michaud has reached out and said, here's some of the things that we, to be competitive with other folks, we're maybe looking $16, $18 an hour. So beyond that, though, as we've heard others, what else can be done? What can we as a state, what can we as appropriators, as legislators, as representatives of our population do? Because the IDD community is one that not only simply from a matter of legal, but from a compassion standpoint, that these folks have to be taken care of. So what really beyond a wage can we do to help moving forward?
Those are excellent questions, and I'm going to probably disappoint you with my immediate first answer, which is the number one need for this system is more funding. And I know it will be difficult for us to find the path forward on this, but we must address that need, or else this system will have difficulty sustaining in the future. But beyond the need for more funding, I think you raise a number of valid points, and your questions are exactly where providers are currently, as well as how do we move into a modernization of sorts for IDD services, and providers very much want to go that direction. I will tell you that licensure challenges, regulation challenges continue to be something that our members really struggle with. I would give kudos to the folks within KDADS who oversee these programs and services. By and large, they are collaborative and great to work with, but we still have a number of issues regarding what we feel are overregulation of these services and supports. I can come back before this committee at another time to discuss that. It's kind of an entire other issue that we'd be happy to talk with you about. But that certainly makes it easier for us to do the work that we are required to do when we don't have that kind of constant issue of micromanagement, I would say, regarding oversight. Second, as Vicki pointed out in her remarks, I think we've got to find a path forward in professionalizing the direct care workforce within the IDD service field. We are far behind where other human service fields are in terms of professionalizing these types of positions. And I think we can do a much better job of enticing individuals to consider this as a career choice. As Vicki pointed out, we can do a better job in offering a path forward through community colleges, for example. And there are some promising movements forward on that front, but they're very nascent at this point, and will require a lot of support in moving forward. In addition, I think we need to look at meeting this workforce where they are. Student loans. A number of these individuals are young folks who are doing this work and then move on to do other things. If we had a way to perhaps provide tuition support or student loan forgiveness for those who choose this field of work, that would be a wonderful sort of enticement. Similarly, as Vicki pointed out, a number of these folks are working these jobs in addition to being a primary caregiver within their home. So if we had ways to offer, for example, a credit for childcare, that could be incredibly attractive to a single parent who wants to do this kind of work, but just simply can't because their needs as a parent come first. I'm particularly attuned to that today for my own personal reasons, but I don't know, Representative. Those are just a few thoughts off the top of my head. I don't know if they get to the type of answers you were looking for or not.
No, they do, and I appreciate that. So that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we attempted last year to address this a little bit. We increased the rate, is that correct? Is there a reason that that money didn't get down to the employee level?
So, Representative, as I stated in my written testimony, in our survey of our members, they have indicated they used 97% of that rate increase for direct care wages and benefits. So I believe it did get to the workforce. It's just, as much as it was, in terms of an investment, it wasn't enough. And I know that's hard to wrap our heads around when we talk about large figures, but you have to recall that, we're talking about a system that has, over $4 billion of funding in it. And as Representative Carpenter pointed out, the workforce that we're talking about here is about 20,000, and that's a soft estimate. We don't have a hard estimate on that population of the workforce. So we are talking about a rather large system that even when we make large investments, it doesn't always move the needle. For example, this rate increase last year, we heard from a number of providers that did take the money, put it into wages. It equated to about $1 an hour increase in what they were able to offer their direct care workforce.
So would that, I'm sorry.
I want to say Representative Tarwater.
Would that mean that these employees were being paid $9 an hour last year and they're being paid $10 this year? Yes? Okay. So we hear this over and over and over in commerce. Workforce development is a huge issue all over the state for all companies, and every company is having to relook at how they operate their entire business just to try to make it work. Maybe if some of these companies could send their financials in, a group of us could sit down and maybe consult with them and try to find other ways to find efficiencies to help raise funds for employees. Thank you.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And coincidentally, I'm kind of dovetailing off of the previous question. Matt, you mentioned a phrase that certainly caught my attention. You mentioned that the regulatory oversight and licensure issues presents a major hurdle for a lot of your employees. Would it be possible, certainly not right now, I get it, but would it be possible for you to kind of outline some of those issues so that maybe, not necessarily in this committee because we're the appropriators, but at a different point, we can look at some of those issues and see if maybe there's something we can do to make that lift a little bit lighter?
Absolutely, Representative. And in fact, we have a work group working on just that right now. And so we'd be happy to make that available to you at a later time.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Estes.
Thank you. In my mind, I'm trying to reconcile what you and the previous conferee have said on that professional development path versus burdensome regulation. And I'm concerned that there's a potential down the road for an unintended consequence that makes it harder to hire people, because now we have certifications and we have less people we can hire because they don't have the certification. But I'm also assuming that this is something you guys have thought through. So can you please help me reconcile those issues?
Sure, and I think those are very valid concerns. We don't accidentally want to create a more difficult scenario for recruitment of this workforce, but I think what we can do is provide options for folks who come into this work and have a passion for it and a heart for it to continue in it as a viable career choice. And so we don't want to gatekeep it so that folks can't come in and experience it. But we do want to make it viable down the road. So perhaps what we're looking at is different levels of direct care or direct support work, in which, as an individual comes into the field and recognizes it's something that really resonates with them personally and spiritually, then they have a lattice, a pathway forward to then make it a viable choice that they can provide for their family while doing this work, for example.
Thank you.
Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. I want to go back to when we formed CanCare in 2013, the IDD population were exempt for like 14 months. So we didn't, that population did not come into CanCare. After that, they were. So my question will be, is IDD better off today, about the same, or is it worse? Because it was in pretty good shape when we had it just operating by itself. And I think you would have to exclude COVID, because I think COVID would have skewed something regardless of what program we were talking about. But in terms of IDD, now, is that population better off, as we promised when we did CanCare, that would be more effective and more efficient? Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I would say that by and large, the population supported has maintained what was a high level of quality of service after its inclusion in managed care. So I don't want to dig up old battles, but one of our arguments at the time, Representative, was that the IDD system was already doing a very good job of managing the long-term care and the physical health care needs of this population. We still went into CanCare ultimately, and I would say that by and large, the individuals are still receiving that high quality of services and supports. Maybe to put a little bit different spin on your question, for the providers who serve them, I think by and large, their experience within CanCare has been, that it's just another layer of administration that they now have to comply with and find ways to navigate and in order to be reimbursed for the services they provide. So.
Any further questions for Matt? Representative Wolfmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. Did I hear you say during the course of your presentation that you're turning over about 48% of your direct care workforce?
Yes, that's correct.
So, I mean, that takes significant resources just to hire, rehire, train. I mean, it seems pretty evident to me that we have a major problem, and we're just spending good money after bad by not making these jobs, one, more professional, so you have a little bit of a path, but also $10 an hour is just, you're going to continue to churn through money as long as we're paying. I mean, it seems fairly obvious to me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, and I agree wholeheartedly. And I think the other data point from our survey is telling as well. The the 116 days on average that a new direct care hire stays within an organization. They come in, they experience the job, they begin to realize how hard the work is, and the pay is not great, and they move on. But they have stayed long enough for the organization to have invested significant resources in onboarding them, because there's about 30 to 40 hours of training that's required on the front end for a direct care worker before they can provide direct care service without supervision. And there may be additional hours of required training based upon whatever policies and procedures an organization has in place. Those are significant costs that are rolled up into a new hire, only to have them walk out the door less than 4 months later.
All right, thank you. Committee, any further questions for Matt? All right, seeing none, thank you for joining us virtually. Hope your sound gets better. The next individual we're going to be hearing from is Doug Wisby, the CEO for the Multi-Community Diversified Supports, and he's joining us virtually as well. Doug?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today, members of the committee. My name is Doug Wisby. I am the president and CEO for MCDS in McPherson, Kansas. We're also a nonprofit provider of services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We've been providing services in McPherson County since about 1974. I know you've heard a lot of testimony today, so I'll try to make mine pretty short. We've always struggled with hiring and retaining people based upon pay and benefits, and of course the nature of the job itself. We would normally have about 100, somewhere between 100 and 110 employees. If I was to look today, we're probably in the 70s somewhere. It's really been a profound shift in our ability to hire and retain folks probably over the last 2 years. I've been here for 18 years, and I have to admit I've never seen anything like what we've seen over the last 2 years. We pretty much came to a tipping point back in October of last year, in that we were so short of staff, we've had to close multiple programs and actually combine a number of residential settings to the point where we have clients actually sleeping on cots in common areas. The reason we've had to do this is we just simply cannot hire enough staff to man all the locations. And we've done all the things that have been talked about previously. We've hit our salary and administrative people to work direct care and anybody and everybody we possibly could. We've paid shift differentials and retention and referral bonuses. We've been trying to hire for almost 50 years. I like to think we're pretty good at it, but there's just nothing out there. This occurred back in October, and this is before COVID actually hit us again, which it's currently doing across the state. And honestly, I don't know that I see this changing anytime soon. I think even once COVID dies down once again, I think the shortages will continue. We're kind of at a tipping point for us as an agency, and frankly, I think we're at a tipping point for us as a group of agencies throughout the state. The problem is, I don't believe there's any capacity out there amongst other community service providers to serve folks. So should providers start to fail, I don't think there's anything out there that could pick up the slack in the community. And I don't believe there's any capacity at the state level, either at the state hospitals or institutions, to pick those folks up either. I do believe that we're at a point where I think the state's going to have to decide whether they want to invest in the community or look at alternatives. But as has been talked about previously, a lot of folks that we serve have profound needs. We serve a lot of folks that are what we call dual diagnosis. So they're also mentally ill and have significant challenging behaviors. And so it's kind of a witch's brew of a lot of problems coming together at once. And I would certainly take your questions as such.
All right, thank you, Doug. Committee, are there any questions for Doug? I'm not seeing any, but thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
All right, committee, that is going to be closing the informational briefing that we're having in regards to the intellectual and developmental disability provider and reimbursement rate. We're going to go back and circle to the one item on the agenda, which is the presentation on the Special Committee on the Home and Community-Based Services Intellectual and Developmental Disability Waiver Committee Report, which this committee met in October of 2021. And so now I will turn over to Matthew Moore, who has returned from the Senate to join us this morning and give us a briefing on that special committee. Matthew?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Matthew Moore. I'm a fiscal analyst with Legislative Research. Just wanted to provide you a brief overview of the recommendations made by the Special Committee on Home and Community-Based Services, Intellectual and Developmental Disability Waiver. As the chairman indicated, we met over 2 days in October. We heard a lot of testimony from the agencies in general on the eligibility for the waiver. We heard from the agencies and stakeholder organizations and families with individuals on the wait list, just about the struggles that they have on the wait list in general. We heard from providers on their workforce struggles. And then at the very end, we heard testimony from the agencies as well as a few other organizations on reimbursement rates and funding for the waivers. Really, I would just like to highlight the recommendations on the first 2 pages of the committee report, pages 3 and 4. The committee made 10 total recommendations. I don't want to go into each one individually, but overall, they generally fall into 3 categories. I would say further study, funding for the waiver, and sort of issues surrounding the structure of the waiver. In that first sort of category of studying the waiver, the committee made a recommendation. That was the very first one on the Legislative Coordinating Council consider approval of a committee or task force that's similar in structure to the Mental Health Modernization Committee with working groups that's met over 2020 and 2021 interim to kind of study and look at modernization of the waiver. Sort of the second study sort of recommendation is the fourth one down of having KDADS kind of conduct some analysis on a specific service, targeted case management rates for the waiver and kind of compare those to similar programs in KDHE, the STEPS program. And the final one I'd like to touch on that was studies was that the second from the last one on the bottom of page 3, KDADS with KDHE will collect and provide information on actual service needs of individuals on the wait list and on the waiver. We heard testimony over those 2 days of how an individual is assessed when they come on, when they are found eligible for the wait list, and then it may be years until they get onto the wait list and are reassessed. So there was some question about whether or not we can get some kind of a reevaluation of those individuals on the wait list to kind of determine what their actual needs are today, as opposed to maybe years ago when they were actually put on the wait list. And at the same time, kind of reevaluate individuals on the wait list to help sort of better understand what those individuals' needs are. The second group of recommendations, as I said, was funding. There were several recommendations for KDADS to provide estimates for specific kind of categories of waiver services and kind of look at those, see what sort of rates they are now, what an increase might be, and provide those estimates to the Social Services budget as well as the Senate Ways and Means Human Services Subcommittee. I would highlight on the second recommendation there that the legislature approved funding for IDD waivers with the intention that that funding be sort of provided for direct salary increases, as well as for the legislature to sort of identify areas within the budget that they might be able to reduce expenditures that would then free up additional funds for IDD waiver expenditures. And that would be kind of fourth from the bottom there. The last sort of category of recommendations I would like to touch upon are sort of reviewing the structure of the waiver itself. I'd touch upon the third from the bottom. There was some discussion about kind of the authority under which the waiver sort of exists. Currently, the waiver is a comprehensive waiver. So if you're eligible for services on the IDD waiver, you're eligible for all of the services. There was some testimony of how other states might do things a little bit differently, might have a different waiver authority that might allow for individuals to be eligible for the waiver but not be eligible for all of the services. So there was a kind of request that the legislature study other states, how we might be able to restructure the waiver, look at other Medicaid authorities to allow kind of more services kind of that are targeted more towards that individual's needs, and see if that might help reduce the wait list. The next sort of recommendation I'd like to touch upon is that very last one on page 3. There was some discussion of providing individuals who self-direct their services, so who may not go through an organization but may do it themselves, to provide them with individual budget authority so they might be able to have a little bit more flexibility in providing paying their workers to kind of meet their individual needs. And then the final one I'd like to touch upon is just that last one on page 4, that the legislature sort of explore potential legislation to provide automatic annual adjustments for the reimbursement rates. And this was also kind of a topic that was, should the LCC approve a committee, that might be a topic that committee looks upon. Again, the rest of the report sort of just goes over some of the testimony, some of the presentations that were provided. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
All right, thank you, Matthew. And committee, if you'll notice on the front page of the document that was submitted to you, you'll notice that there were 4 individuals from this committee who served on this special committee for those 2 days when we heard information and testimony from the departments or either the stakeholders or those involved. We also heard testimony from parents. And so, I mean, it was a very intriguing special committee that was formed. Also, I think Matthew kind of touched on this, on what other states are doing. I think all of us were, some were aware of it, some were not. But like, for example, the state of Louisiana completely eliminated their waiting list. How they did that is that they made some strategic changes in waiver classifications so that waiting list was eliminated, but it just shifted it over. So we just have to look at what other states have been doing, what they're doing in regards to our waiting list, because right now, if I remember correctly, once you get on the waiting list, it's about 10 years until you actually qualify. So there is obviously room for improvement in regards to the waiting list for the state of Kansas. We can look to other states and see what they've been doing, but not necessarily follow exactly the state of Louisiana, because all they did is just shift it to another classification. Representative Wolfmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on page 3, the very bottom one that you kind of went into a little, the legislature can continue providing individual budget authority. How would that work? Could you maybe go into that one a bit more for me?
So my understanding in terms of when you're on the waiver, there are sort of 2 ways. You can either have an agency provide those services, and then they hire the worker, and then you can self-direct. And so those individuals that self-direct then do sort of, I guess, all the administrative functions that an agency would provide. And there was some concern brought up by some of the organizations that currently an individual is sort of restricted in terms of how much money they might be able to provide, individual providers of their services, and that if they were to be able to have authority to take that sort of pot of money that they receive, it's the same amount that they would receive if they were with an agency, but then be able to make kind of more decisions in terms of, well, if I need more like overnight services, I'm not finding an individual to provide that service, that they might be able to maybe increase the rate that they would provide that individual to maybe try and hopefully entice someone to provide that service. So it would, the thought being that if they had that sort of flexibility, they might be able to better find individuals to serve their specific needs.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So last year, we increased the the provider rate. And so how does the increased provider rate that we provided, and please let us know again, what was that increase that we provided, overlap with the waiver needs that are listed here? And how much of that money potentially did we earmark for those increases that will help address some of these issues related to the waiver?
So, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, in terms of the increases from last year, and forgive me the exact dollar amount, I think it was roughly $20 million all funds for FY22. There was the increase in 21 was about, I think, 5% for the last 4 months, and then that continues into 22, and then an additional 2%. And it was roughly, I think, about 20 million all funds. That my understanding is that funding is then, increases the individual rates that the MCOs then would reimburse providers for, and those funds go to the providers, and then they use that sort of pocket of money that they receive to then pay the direct staff. But total, it was, I think, approximately about $20 million for both the 5% continuing and the increase of 2%, so the 7% that Representative Carpenter mentioned earlier.
So what I'm understanding is that the 20 million we provided have been used for catch-up, and they are not being used to increase worker pay. Then what are they being used for?
Mr. Chairman of the committee, my understanding in the testimony in the committee, and I think today as well, that individuals receive that fund or those funds, and then the providers increase their reimbursement or the actual salary for their workers. So that pocket of money increased the reimbursement rate that the MCOs would then provide to the organization, and then that organization would follow through and increase the rates for their actual workers. And I know that there was a lot of testimony during the committee that they did find that increase helpful and that they were able to translate that into an increase, but it was, approximately about $1 increase to the actual salaries for their individuals.
So if I'm understanding, in part, it did help increase some wages, but may not be sustainable?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I don't know if I can necessarily talk about the sustainability of the increase.
That's okay. I can talk to the chair later. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when you talked about the 20 million, you said all funds. What percentage of that was SGF?
So, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I apologize, I don't have the exact figure. It would be roughly about 60. Well, so because it's 22, I think there's a little bit because there's a temporary FMAP increase, but it's approximately about 60-40 of that. So 40% of that 20 million would be SGF. Might be a little bit higher because of the increase in the FMAP. But it's approximately 60 federal funds and 40% state general funds.
And does that relationship on the 60 to 40 stay if there's further increases, or is there a federal cap on the match?
I'm not aware of a specific cap. I know, for instance, with the pandemic, there's a temporary increase of 6.2, so that sort of increases that the 60-40 is the base kind of rate for the split. With the 6.2, that sort of raises it to about 35 state general fund and about 65, I believe, federal funds. And so, there's a little bit of flexibility there. I'm not aware of a specific cap on it, but that base rate is about 40/60.
And so when we do an increase like this, and it was $20 million last year, what percentage of that is kept by the MCOs and what percentage kind of flows through to the IDD providers?
That I'd have to double check. I know that the MCOs receive a per member per month, and then they sort of take that pocket of money, and then that's what they provide the reimbursements out of. But I'd have to double check on the actual mechanics of how that reimbursement works when it comes from the state to the MCOs and the MCOs to the provider. But I can get some information for that.
A little slow. Say that again. I mean, they get a base fee plus a percent, or?
My understanding is that they receive a per member per month, which then they reimburse from. And I'd have to double check with the agency on exactly the mechanics of how that operates. And I can get a little bit more information of what that process looks like, and then provide that to you at a later date. Like I said, I have to double check exactly what the mechanics of that are.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think kind of along those lines, and I want Chairman Carpenter to correct me if I'm wrong. But first of all, Medicaid is an average of 60-40, period. Doesn't make any difference. And the enhanced FMAP that we're getting right now isn't necessarily going to the providers or to these services. That's why you'll see surpluses in some areas. And I believe that the money, and again, this goes back to Chairman Carpenter, is for the IDD that went to the providers, not the MCOs. Would that be right, Mr. Chairman?
Chairman Carpenter.
Correct. It was a provider rate increase.
Right, so that went to them. That had nothing to do with the MCOs. The MCO contract operates on a different basis. So just kind of a little bit of a further detailed explanation of how that works. But whenever you think of what we do in Medicaid, it's an average of 60-40. It could actually be, 57-43. So just to give you an idea how it works. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Representative Landwehr. Committee, any further questions for Matthew? All right, I'm not seeing any. Thank you, Matthew, for the briefing on the special committee for the ACBS services waiver. Committee, that kind of concludes all of the information that we have for today. Tomorrow, we're going to be having an update by Secretary Mike Beam with the Department of Agriculture, and then also an update from the President, Ed Cross, from the Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association. So until tomorrow, we are adjourned.